Basically what I want to do is kind of give you an overview of some of the things we've tried. I'm going to throw in a few comments about poultry meats. I work a lot with the HACCP issues associated with poultry meat producers, and some things go along equally as what we're doing in eggs. Some are a little different, and so I'm going to kind of point those out when they come along here. But basically I'm going to start out with eggs, and it's estimated that egg-related illnesses from Salmonella are approximately 79,000 cases per year, with 30 deaths caused by the consumption of eggs contaminated with Salmonella enteritidis. And although I'm going to speak a lot, we're going to concentrate, I guess I should say, this presentation on Salmonella enteritidis, because that is what is the major concern in eggs. But what we have also found out is that as we clear up the SE, or the Salmonella enteritidis, what we have emerging is Salmonella Heidelberg. So I'm going to mention it a little bit, although this afternoon, if you happen to attend our session talking about the impact of the FDA's final rule on eggs, its focus primarily is on Salmonella enteritidis. But basically what CDC says is, from those numbers, not everyone's seeking care, so we don't know exactly, so there's a lot of guesstimates here as to how many illnesses are really due to Salmonella in the eggs, because they're not reported. We get sick. We don't really know if it's the Salmonella we eat. A lot of time, the contamination from the products that we eat. And a lot of times when people get a foodborne illness, and even if they do seek help, a lot of times they will get asked, well, have you had any poultry products? And if the answer is yes, well, you probably have Salmonella, but they're not going to test for it. It's just the assumption, poultry, Salmonella. I used to work at NC State in Raleigh, North Carolina, and they had a fish baron's ball. And they came back, and some people had gotten sick at the fish baron's ball, and they came back and they were giving me a hard time, and they were going, we got sick, and it's probably from those eggs that we used in making our products for the fish baron's ball. And I'm going, did you use local eggs? And they were going, yeah, we use North Carolina eggs. And I said, I'm sure it's not in North Carolina eggs. And they were going, well, we got Salmonella. Some people got tested. So for several weeks, I went around getting harassed I was in the food science department about the Salmonella problems at the fish baron's ball. Well, guess what? It wasn't the eggs. It was from some of their fish. So I got a good laugh in the end, but that is the typical response that you get. If you've eaten eggs or if you've eaten poultry and there's Salmonella issues, they're going to come back, and if there's nothing else left, what's left in your refrigerator, if there's some eggs, you've usually still got some eggs around. So they'll test the eggs. Eggs aren't positive. Well, there's only 1 in 20,000 that's potentially positive, so it must have been that one that we used that, had the Salmonella in it. So we get a lot of blame. I'm not saying that's always the case, but it's always interesting to listen to the tracebacks of what was the reason for the foodborne outbreak. I'm not saying that there's never any due to eggs. Yes, there are, and we'll talk about some of the reasons that we have those. But basically, Salmonella enteritidis oftentimes, or Salmonella, trades back and forth with Campylobacter being the major cause of foodborne illness. But the poultry processing plants, FSI has put all of the emphasis on controlling Salmonella on the processing plant and what happens in the processing plant. And they were able to reduce the Salmonella from 20% to 10% in most cases. But what they found was after they got down to the 10%, it's really hard to keep doing something in the processing plant. You've got to move back to the farm to look at what's coming in. I mean, some plants have gone to the point of looking at the contamination level and processing birds according to contamination level. Well, in the case of eggs, that's really not going to help much, because once the egg comes in, if it's contaminated internally, there's not a whole lot you can do to get rid of the Salmonella. So more of the emphasis has been put back on the farm rather than in the processing plant. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But I want to mention just a couple of things about the comparison between Salmonella enteritidis and Salmonella Heidelberg. We were asked by the American Egg Board to do a cooking study to look at how effective different cooking methods were in killing salmonella, and that the emphasis was on Salmonella enteritidis. So we used a cocktail of a variety of serotypes of enteritidis, and we got typically what you'd expect. You know, if you're going to do a sunny side up egg, you're not really going to get a really good kill. If you boil the egg, hard boil it, you can get a good kill. If you start scrambling, it depends on how much of that egg got to the very base of the pan, that type of thing. But the thing that popped up is we didn't use Heidelberg. But when we were doing our test, we found Heidelberg a couple of times. It's more rare than enteritidis, but it can get in the internal contamination of the eggs. And the other thing that we discovered is that it's more likely to survive the cooking methods than was the Salmonella enteritidis. So I'm not sure if we clear out the way, so to speak, if we clear out one organism, we have something else emerge. And I'm not sure if we're allowing Heidelberg to emerge when we clear out some of the Salmonella enteritidis. So I just throw that out as a question. But let's look at the location of the contamination and what the egg industry is doing to control Salmonella. If we look at the internal contamination, about the only thing you really can do is you can prevent the infection, because once it's inside the egg, when you process the egg, it comes into the plant. If you didn't prevent it, you're going to have to pasteurize it. Now, we do have in-shell pasteurized eggs, but we don't have a lot of them. They're a lot more costly than the typical shell egg. So we're probably not going to kill it. The best we can do is to control it. And so that's where a lot of the regulations have gone with regard to refrigeration. We have seen the first regulations that came out was you used to see eggs setting in the aisle in the grocery store, especially around Easter time. They'd want more eggs in, they'd just set them out in the aisles. Well, they passed the law that says once the egg has gone through the packing operations in a carton, it's been washed and cleaned, it has to be refrigerated. The law says it has to be refrigerated at an ambient temperature of 45 degrees. Anybody have any idea if I had a pallet of eggs, and let's say our pallet of eggs is made up of 30 cases, and a case contains 30 dozen of eggs. So I have 30 cases set up, and it's like a 5-foot cube. If I look at the center egg in that pallet, how long do you think that it will take the center egg in that pallet, the geometric center, to cool to the ambient temperature? 24 hours? 32 hours? 48 hours? 7 to 14 days. And if you've ever been in an egg operation and you go in, the pallet isn't setting in the middle of the floor with lots of room around it. Because we know that when we go into a warehouse, what do? We save space, so we shift them in there, get them as close as we can. But it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference because those eggs move out really fast. My point is they're not going to cool down to 45 degrees at the point in time that they're in that cooler. But I just want you to see that as we go through, and you'll notice since we had the refrigeration change law that was put into effect several years ago, maybe 8 years ago, I can't remember now exactly when it came into effect, we've seen some differences in egg packaging. We're seeing a lot more of the eggs. They don't come in those cardboard boxes as much anymore. They're coming more in the dairy-type open cases. We're seeing more interesting designs in egg cartons. We're seeing more of it so that there's more air moving around. Because not only were we putting those eggs in the cartons and then putting them in cases to transport them, those cartons were really good insulators, So if we happen to have a salmonella in one of those eggs and it happened to be that geometric center egg, it had a good chance to do some growing, before it actually got to the location where it would be spread out and cool a little bit faster where the consumer might use it. Okay, so the egg industry has done a lot of things to try to reduce the potential of salmonella in eggs because back as my son and grandkids say, back in the dark ages when I was in graduate school, we never thought that if an egg was not cracked, that there could be anything inside of that egg that would hurt you, no contamination. But we now know that we can have contamination occur in the reproductive tract, so that as the yolk, before the albumin is even applied in the reproductive tract, we can have Salmonella get onto the outside of the yolk, which is the most common place in between the yolk and the albumin. Okay, so we've done some testing. We test the chicks. There's a number of quality assurance programs in a lot of different states. It's been very effective in reducing the number of Salmonella. Like I said, even at the point in time that it was the worst, we had 1 in 20,000 eggs. That's an awful lot of eggs to test to find that one. So it's very difficult. You're not going to see numbers where they've done tests to actually tell you what the rate is now. I'm not sure we really even know what the rate was. I'm not sure, other than the Pennsylvania pilot project, that we've ever tested enough eggs in any one place to get that true rate. But these quality assurance programs that are out, there's several of them, and UEP, the United Egg Producers, has one of the most common ones, which involves testing chicks to make sure that at the point in time that they come in, before they're put into a situation that they could lay eggs and produce contaminated eggs, they're checked to make sure they're salmonella free. We have best management practices, biosecurity, vaccines, and all of these are really detailed in the final rule, unlike the FSIS and putting all the emphasis on the processing plant for Salmonella for poultry products. What they're looking at eggs is putting the emphasis on the farm. And we'll have more discussion of that a little bit later this afternoon if you're interested. So if we move from on-farm and all the things that are done at that level to bring them in, what are the things that we've done earlier? And this is sort of the direction that we've gone. Looking at post-harvest, once those eggs come in, and most eggs nowadays are processed at the same site at which they are laid. So we have inline operations. We have 1 million birds, 2 million birds, and they're coming in. There's still some contracts coming in. We have some offline operations. But what I'm saying is that the majority of the eggs that you're probably getting are inline operations, which means that they're being laid with 24 hours those eggs are being processed. That's not to say if you get to smaller operations, then they're going to be produced at an off-site. They're going to have to be collected, and how fast they're collected off those farms and brought in are another story. And that's some of the things that the food safety final rule addresses. But there is some concern over what's happening to those. I've been to Canada. I've done some consulting up there looking at their operations a little bit different in that the government has allotments, and then they buy those eggs, and the eggs are then shipped to wherever they need. So those eggs may be a little older by the time they get to the consumer because of the way they move them around and hold them. So in doing that, keep in mind that when you pick up a carton of eggs at the grocery store, and it has generally a 28 to 30 day expiration date, do you know when that date starts? The day the egg is packaged. So the day that the egg goes through the processing to be washed, that's the day, that's its birthday. It's not the day that it was laid, which a lot of people think that's the day that it was laid, but that's not the case. Okay, so it's packaged, it goes through. There's pasteurization, there's refrigeration, and there's cooking. That's the only way that we're going to do any kind of control. What FDA is most concerned with, and they're the people that are regulating shell eggs, once you break the eggs out, it goes to the FSIS regulation. But if they're only looking at internal contamination, and we'll talk a little bit more about contamination on the external side, because we know that on-farm procedures that have been implemented have helped clean up farms, have helped, as far as SE goes, has helped reduce the amount of salmonella that is in the environment. But we know anything like rodents or insect infestations, anything like that could spread salmonella across. Well, the research that I've done also shows that over time, if it is on the external portion of the shell, there is a potential for it to get on the internal. It could move through, or it could, anybody ever crack an egg and part of the shell goes into the bowl where you crack it? You know, that could have salmonella on it. So you have to be concerned with what's on the shell as well. You have to be concerned with cracks or even micro cracks. So what we do primarily with washing eggs, hopefully to remove all of the contamination on the outside, is we wash eggs, and if eggs are, how many of you buy eggs that have a USDA seal on the carton? Ever notice the USDA seal? Those are called shielded eggs. And probably 15 years ago, most of the eggs were shielded. And consumers assumed, okay, these eggs have been graded, they're shielded. What a lot of companies found is that consumers didn't really pay that much attention to it, and that's a voluntary program. And you don't have to, I mean, the eggs are still graded. They're still, you know, they still go through the same process. But interestingly enough, some of the laws only apply to those shielded eggs. And I'm not saying processors do things differently, but it's just the egg laws are all messed up. There are different organizations. They apply to different groups. For a while, they were very different from state to state. We're just now finally getting things kind of organized so that everybody is operating under the same rules, which is totally opposite from the poultry industry, which is so totally integrated, so, you know, so regulated, you know, every move they make, they know what, you know, there's a regulation almost written for it seems like. Where in the eggs, it's a little bit different. So, if you look at what's required, the laws for washing eggs say that the eggs have to be washed at 120, or they have to be washed at 90 degrees, or 20 degrees warmer than the warmest egg. So you can see that temperatures go up if it's an inline operation because eggs may not have cooled down as fast. There may be 108 degrees when they're laid, and then they'll cool down a little bit. Well, as the eggs go through the washing process, the average wash temperature is like 115 degrees. So you send this egg through the wash process. It picks up 12 to 14 degrees as it goes through the wash process. You put it into a foam carton. Close that foam carton up, put it in those pallets, and you can see how it could take days because you've heated it up, and it will continue to heat after it goes into the carton for several hours because that shell is a good insulate, holds a lot of heat in it, and so it'll continue to disperse that heat. So then it has to start to cool down. Okay, so we're not going to wash the eggs at a temperature that's hot enough to kill the bacteria because we'll cook the egg. That albumin will start coagulating. And so you can't get the temperatures up really high to do that. So we have to rely more onto the pH. And so the wash water in eggs, for eggs is recirculated. So we want to control the pH in that wash water so that we don't end up having an inoculation pit as we're washing our eggs. So we run the pH at a pH of 10 to 11 so that we can control any bacteria that would be in that wash water. And then we rinse those eggs and then put them on and send them out into the grocery store. So that's how we're controlling the outer portion. Now, the only problem you have is if you have egg bacteria contamination that got down into the pores and then would not be caught by that wash. Then you'd have to worry about what moves through. So if there's any cracks, that's one reason you don't want cracks in your eggs, because if there's cracks, you can also have external contamination going to the internal. So we've moved to electronic crack detectors, you know, all these dirt detectors and everything on our washing systems to move these eggs through. And all of this is to control the external, because like I said, from the internal side, the best thing you can do is get them cooled as fast as you can, unless you're going to pasteurize them and send them to a breaker. If you, according to the egg laws, the one thing that I'm really concerned about in looking at what is predicted is if you're in the Midwest, you're probably okay in your shell egg operation. But what if you're in the Southeast, where I live, there's not really any breakers. So let's say you had an environmental contamination, you tested, and you do actually have an SE test positive for your eggs, and you have to divert. Where are you going to send your eggs? And how are you going to handle the market that you have? So those are some of the issues that are on the top of the minds of egg producers right now, and looking at the final rule and how they're going to handle those. Is what happens if I happen to be positive? It's a rare occurrence, and they're testing. But if you are, you have to divert. So where are you going to get the eggs to fill your market, and how are you going to get rid of the eggs that you have? You can't just start cooking. The option is, I could cook those eggs, but how am I going to cook those eggs if I'm not set up on a shell egg operation? I don't have a way to do that. So cooking is an option, and this is where most of the outbreaks occur, okay? We're usually talking about very, very low levels of salmonella within the internal portion of an egg. So why is it causing a problem? I mean, when we talked about thousands of outbreaks, and we're only talking about one egg in 20,000, why do we have this problem? And it's generally an abuse issue, where you go to a food service establishment. Anybody like to eat at buffets? Teenagers love it, especially teenage boys. It can't seem to fill up. I had one of those. But his favorite meal was a buffet. I also used to teach food sanitation when I worked at the University of Wisconsin in River Falls. And I used to send my students to different types of restaurants. I'd send them to a buffet, to a sit-down restaurant, to a fast food restaurant, and tell them just to observe what you can see from a sanitation standpoint. And this was a small town, and I finally got to tell them, just don't give me the names of the restaurants, just give me what you saw. Because after a while, there's no place that you really want to eat. Even in big cities, you run out. And and it's not always the restaurant person's fault. Next time you go to a buffet, just sit back and take a look. My son's going to CRNA school to become a nurse anesthetist, and my daughter-in-law is in nursing school, so they live with me with their 4 kids, who range from 2 to 12. We have been known to go to buffets. I feel for the people that come after us. But you can look at all the kids in the buffet line. I want some of that, stick your finger in. And you know what they call the little bar at the top of a buffet, the little glass? It's a sneeze bar. How many people, observe this, actually stand above the sneeze bar so that should they sneeze, hopefully they're not going to sneeze in it anyway. A lot of people are a lot shorter than that bar. But just take a look. There's potential for contamination. We're talking about a warming table that is just the right temperature, for that inoculant. But worst yet, nobody wants scrambled eggs that are all dry. So what do they put out on a buffet bar? They put out some kind of liquid egg to keep that, they don't cook it as dry as what you might cook at home. Okay, you have just one egg that's contaminated and you mix it into that. You got the perfect setup for growth. Well, what have we done in more recent years to solve that problem? I actually heard that if you put, my brother used to put raw eggs into this drink he had, and then he told me he could put some tequila in there and it'd kill everything. They actually did some tests. That doesn't work. Neither does Tabasco. But it's a good story. You're right. But what we're moving to, and you'll see this a lot more, particularly in institutions like hospitals, nursing homes, those vulnerable populations, we're moving to pasteurized egg product so that those populations are not going to be negatively impacted. They can still have their product. But what we have to be sure to teach food service people is once they open up those pasteurized eggs, they're just as, maybe even more, vulnerable to contamination. It's not like these will never be contaminated. And believe it or not, some people really get this mentality. So they start sticking that scoop in, and they'll scoop it out, and we have to go. But you have to remember, wherever you put that scoop, you can put it back in and you can inoculate it. I've spent some time working with food service establishments, and I love to go out to eat, so obviously this didn't impact me too much. But going around and looking at HACCP things, they don't really understand sometimes, and you have to train employees so that they understand why they're doing something. They don't just want, get past the shortcuts. So working with food service establishments has been a major issue, trying to get them to switch to pasteurized products, to safer products for vulnerable populations, going that direction. We've made a lot of moves over the last few years in getting people to move in that direction to purchase those pasteurized products, so you don't have quite the salmonella issues that you had before. The reason, why is it that you might eat an egg at home that has the contamination and not get sick, but get sick at the institution? The time difference, the lapse, the abuse that you might see. The eggs are probably abused less at home, and once you cook them, you eat them quickly, rather than a food service establishment like a buffet where they may be cooked, they may not be thoroughly cooked, And like I said, we did some work for the American Egg Board, and we looked at a lot of the processes that people typically cook eggs. And a lot of them are not going to guarantee you, if there truly was 1 or 2 organisms on there, that you're really going to kill those. Now, a healthy individual, that may not make that person sick anyway. But if you have a susceptible individual, or if such as someone that's been sick, been on antibiotics, kill out everything, come back, eat something, you're more likely to get sick then than you would be beforehand. So there's a lot of education that we've moved to. But as we move forward with the FDA and the final rule that's coming up, we're putting a lot more emphasis on the farm. And that's where the final rule, most of the requirements are. And if you're interested, join us this afternoon, and we're going to talk about those in detail. But one of the things that I'll throw out is, if this works, and this is kind of our first time of going back and really seeing regulations on the farm, a lot of the other producers are going, if that's happening in the egg industry, am I next? If they're going to look at these requirements, and these are some pretty specific requirements regarding fly numbers, regarding biosecurity, environmental testing, is that moving to the next phase where we look at that on all animal production?